Welcome back to another edition of Components Breakdown. Today we're going to look at one of my highest scored games on Board Game Geek of all time, and that is Middle-earth Quest. Middle-earth Quest is a 2 to 4 player game that can take anywhere from 2 to 3 hours to complete. It is a game that includes variable player powers and a lot of hand management. It's a very thematic game that takes place in the Lord of the Rings universe. So, with that, let's open up the box and take a look at what comes inside. The first thing I wanted to say about Middle-earth Quest is that it can be a very intimidating game to first witness. There are a lot of components in the game, and it comes with a very hefty 40-page rulebook, so it's not one of the easier games to learn, and the majority of my playtime consists of just my wife and I. So for people that have spouses that they play with and they don't like to learn a lot of rules, this can be a little bit challenging to first introduce. But I can promise you, once you learn the rules, and they're not that challenging once you understand the gameplay, it's a very rewarding game. In fact, I think it's probably a more thematic and a better game than War of the Ring. I tend to like this, and that's why I gave it a 9 out of 10 on Board Game Geek. I really enjoyed this game, but let's delve in and see what comes with the game first. As I said, there is a 40-page rulebook in here, and it is extremely well written, and in the past, Fantasy Flight Games has always had trouble conveying all the different rule sets. Now, they have done a much better job, and don't mind my notes in here, but they've done a much better job over the past couple game releases of really going into deep detail on all the different examples of play. So, this is a very well written rule book. The game ships with 2 gigantic boards that fit together and make up the main playing area, and we'll get into that in a moment. Now, inside of here, the original insert is actually reversed, and this part is raised and this part sinks down. Now, there's just too many components in here to keep it that way, so I've just switched the insert since it is a cardboard insert. I've laid my character cards over here. I've used 2 Plano boxes to house the majority of the components, and in here you can see there are a lot of tokens. There are the painted miniatures that I painted. A lot of the cards are housed in here. And the second Plano box also has additional tokens that won't fit, and these are for the attributes and the favor tokens. And the last thing I have in here is a old rook case I don't use anymore, but it houses even more cards inside. So as I said, this is very similar to Arkham Horror. There's just a lot of cards in the game. So with that, let's actually lay out the game and show you how it plays. So now we have all the components laid on the table, and as you can see, there is just a huge number of them, and it can be very intimidating. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through all the components in a little more detail, show you what the game ships with, and then we're going to break it down and show you some basic gameplay elements and see if it's something you might be interested in. So the first thing we're going to start with is the board itself, and it is a very large board. It's actually 2 boards that are fit together, and I just pulled them apart there for you guys to see. It's going to take up a large footprint on your table. So with that, let's look at the board itself and show you all the different areas. Well, the overall objective in Middle-earth Quest is for the shadow player to advance their story markers all the way to the finale space, and that takes place on this large scoring track at the very top right of the board. Now, there's 4 different markers. 3 of them are for the shadow player, and 1 of them is for the free peoples. Now, all the while you're trying to advance this story marker to the end, you're trying to complete a specific mission. So when you get to the finale, you have to see if you've completed your mission in the game. Now, the gameplay takes place between the time that Gandalf first discovers the ring and the time that he actually goes back to the Shire. So it takes place before the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which is kind of cool because it uses a lot of the central characters in the Lord of the Rings, but it introduces some new characters, so it has a really nice background to it that you usually don't get with the Lord of the Rings universe. So going back to the story track here, the mission is to try to get your story marker along the story track before your opponent. And there's 3 different phases. There is a Phase 1, a Phase 2, and a Phase 3. And on each of these areas, they introduce new minions to the game. For instance, the Witch King comes out in Phase 3. So the objective is for each of the players to get this to the finale spot, or for the shadow player to get all 3 of their tokens to the shadow fall space. So looking at the board again, we'll go around in a circle and show you the other areas. In the upper left-hand side, you're going to have all of your favor markers and your character markers, and these are a lot of the characters from the movies. I've only put 4 of them here, but there's 8 in total. In the upper left-hand side, you're going to notice an event space. There's 3 different event stacks, and these come into play during the different story times. So when the markers are in the Stage 1, you're only going to be bringing Stage 1 events. There is a small marker here that's used to be played on the board when persistent events come out, and it just simply shows you where that event is taking place on the board. There is a turn sequence, which is really nice to have on the board itself. There are encounter cards. Now these encounter cards fit different locations on the board, and they're all color coordinated. So for instance, the red and maroon color here fits the red and maroon areas on the board, which is quite nice because you'll be drawing from these locations quite a bit when you have encounters. There is a space for the minions, and we're going to go over the minions real briefly here. It only ships with one of the minions. I had to order a second set because I had a broken miniature from Fantasy Flight, so I went ahead and painted my second set, and I'm going to show you these briefly because I don't want to spend too much time on them, but they do look really nice. They're really well sculpted miniatures, especially the Nazgul, which come on one platform for all 3 of them. And finally, the Witch King. So those can be painted, and I would suggest it for anybody that's into painted miniatures. So moving back on with the board itself, there is a space in the bottom for influence. Influence is the ability of the shadow player to spread their influence across the board, and it's bad for the Free People's player. There is a peril deck, a corruption deck, and a shadow deck that are all used to manipulate specific gameplay elements. There's a large number of these minion monster cards or tokens. Now on the back side, they too are color coordinated that fit in different areas on the board. One side just shows you where they're located, and the other side shows you what creature they're. And for instance, this one has no creature. This one has Crebine, and the last one here looks like Wormtongue. So, as I said, there's numerous amounts of these monster tokens, and I've only put out a couple of them. There is a player. This is the starting player, and this is used when you play with multiple Free People's players, because they're all cooperating together. There are mission cards. These are the missions that you're trying to complete in the game. And they have them both for the Free People's and the shadow player, and that's what you're trying to complete by the time that your story marker advances to the end. There are combat tokens that are placed on people to indicate that they've been damaged. They come in different denominations, obviously. There are the monster cards, which give you the characteristics of all the monsters you'll be fighting. And then there's the monster combat decks, and they come in 3 different styles. There's ones with 4 melee damage, 3 melee damage, and 2. That just shows their abilities, whether they're melee or ranged combat monsters. On the right hand side is where most of the Sauron actions are going to take place. There is a shadow pool. There is a place where the Sauron player will be taking their shadow actions, and it's a really cool mechanic because it uses diminishing returns. The more you use a specific action, the less you're going to get for it. So it really makes the shadow player use different tactics to progress the story. And the main gist of the story is the plot devices here, and it shows up on the Tower of Eridur, I believe. There's 3 different plots that can be in play at one time. There is starting plots, and there's 3 different starting plots that can be used. And what they do is these plots are placed out onto the board, and the Free People's player needs to go and basically get rid of these plots. And there's specific things that you need to do. For instance, there's a 3 favor on this that needs to be used to get rid of this plot. Now plots progress as you see the ring token. It advances once each turn. So this is how the shadow player advances their story markers. When a plot is played on one of these different spaces, you simply place this token on where the plot is taking place. And we'll lastly go over to the other side of the table and show you what Free People's components come in the game. Each of the different characters, and it ships with 5 different Free People's characters, has their own unique deck. And if you notice at the bottom, there's pictures of the characters that you'd be playing. And they all have their own innate abilities on their cards, plus they have specific abilities for their skills. For instance, he's 3 melee and 2 ranged. And of course you're going to have your rangers that are better. And again, they all have their own different unique abilities. Now again, I have painted my guys, and I'll show these briefly. Don't want to spend too much time on them. And the last guy is Barivore. The game also ships with a skill deck, and these can be acquired as the game progresses, and these can be added to your character's combat decks. There are items that can be acquired, and then there are starting quests and advanced quests that can be done by each of the characters. And again, these reward different kinds of things for the Free People's player. The last thing I'm going to cover is the favor. And the favors kind of act like clues in Arkham Horror. You have to go around the board to collect favor in order to shut down certain plots. So it has the same thematic feel, or not thematic feel, but mechanical feel to Arkham Horror. It's cooperative, except you're not playing against the game, you're playing against a shadow player. So with that, let's go into basic gameplay, and then we'll stop with that and give you my final thoughts. So I wanted just to cover some basic gameplay mechanics real quickly if I could. As I said earlier, the game looks a lot more intimidating than it actually is. As Sauron, you're kind of limited to the actions you get each round. If you notice over here, there is an action space. You're actually limited to 2 actions per round for the Sauron player, and every time you use an action in one of those 3 spaces on the board, you get diminishing returns on that specific action. So it's kind of a balancing act of trying to decide on which locations to use, which actions to use, and which things to do. Now each of those different actions give you certain things to use. For instance, there's influence, which are these markers down here, and you can place influence to slow heroes and extend your reach across the board, making it really perilous for heroes to enter specific locations. There are shadow cards and plot cards that you can play, and shadow cards are really important because they're powerful means of kind of hindering and harming the heroes, and plot cards, of course, advance your story markers across the board. So you're always trying to decide on which things to do at what time and where the heroes are. And also you can manipulate monsters, and monsters kind of act in the same way as shadow cards. They're a way to really kind of wear down and defeat your heroes in direct combat. And minions are the same way, so you're kind of going to be balancing between all the different actions you're going to take place. Now as the heroes, the most interesting mechanic is managing your deck of cards. And each hero has their own specific deck that they're going to be used. Now these decks are used not only in combat but in movement as well, and they have icons in the lower right hand side that show you which areas you can move on. For instance, it shows a mountain on that location, so you can move over a mountain area. So when used in combat travel, they're removed and they're put into different piles around the deck, and as your deck diminishes, you're going to have to rest and recuperate in locations that are safe and strongholds. And the last thing really is the mission cards. All the while you're trying to complete these missions by the time that the story marker reaches the end. Now there is an artificial timer in the game because the Free People's mission marker moves 2 spaces every turn. And again, as I said, that can be hampered by specific shadow cards. So you're really going to be working as a team to complete your missions and to try to ward off any kind of monsters or minions that are coming after you. Now, the game can also end in another way, and that is a final battle. So if none of the players complete their missions, but one of the story markers gets to the end, you have to have a final battle with the ring race, and that's kind of a cheesy way to end the game, but it's still really, really good. This, like I said, this is one of my favorite games, and I can't nearly go into the amount of detail that I would and give you a full, gameplay walkthrough, because there's just too many components in the game and too many things going on. But once you learn the game, it's one of the most thematically rewarding games I've ever played. And as I said, it's every bit as good as War of the Ring. In my opinion, it's probably a little bit better because once you play both sides, you really get an appreciation for how well designed this game is. That's why I gave it a 9 on Board Game Geek. I've never given a game a 10, but this is as close to a 10 as I could ever possibly give a game. It's just that good. So again, thanks for watching.